confusion about China that, and let me at least give you my opinion. The popular conception is that companies come to China because of low labor cost. I'm not sure what part of China they go to, but the truth is China stopped being the low labor cost country many years ago. And that is not the reason to come to China from a supply point of view. The reason is because of the skill and the quantity of skill in one location and the type of skill it is.
All right, so that was Tim Cook there talking about China's economic growth strategy and how there's the misconception that China has low labor costs, and so that's why people go over to China to produce. He was actually explaining the advantage China has, its economy has rather. So let's talk about China's economic strategy for growth amidst the global tensions, and what can Africa, what can Nigeria especially learn from it. We just finished the conversation talking about the roles of the tiers of government towards development. So what is here to copy about China? We have Dr. Kenneth Ikenwa, who is a business policy analyst and also a lecturer at University of Lagos, Nigeria. He joins the conversation this morning virtually. Hello, Dr. Ken. Good morning.
Good morning, Blessing. Nice being with you again. Morning to everybody.
It's great to hear and see you. You sound very good, so I'm sure that we're going to have a great conversation.
I'm having volume issues here, so I may have to convert to my earpiece so that I can hear you properly. I hope you can hear me.
Yes, we can hear you loud and clear.
We can see you enjoying the blessings of the Lord.
Thank you very much, sir. Shalom, Imeka.
All right, now, I'm sure that you watched that excerpt from the speech made by Tim Cook, the CEO of Apple Incorporated, and how he was talking about China's economic growth. Let's begin from there. Over the years, there have been many assumptions as to how China has been able to grow its economy and become one of the world powers today. People speculate, some think it's about their production capacity, what they've been able to do regarding production. Some other think is technology. What can we actually say about China, how they've evolved over years to become key player in global economy?
All right. Thank you very much for that question. It's a good thing that at this time in the world, where the global economy is experiencing a global reset, a global restructuring, no thanks, and some thanks also to Trumpism that is holding sway in America and having its multiplier effects around the world. It is good that we begin to discuss and highlight and spotlight countries that have been able to transit themselves from being third world countries to being first world countries and being major economic movers and shakers in the global trade sphere, in the global technology sphere. And China is no less a good example. I would have thought, and from the things I read about the history of Nigeria in the 70s, Nigeria should have been the China of Africa. But I am positive that we have a generation of young minds that would take over and possibly bring that to fruition. Now let's get back to the crux of the matter. What did China actually do? It will interest our viewers to note that as far back as 1960, the our country, precious blessed country called Nigeria, was doing well, doing better than China and most of the Asian tigers, Malaysia, the Indonesias of this world, in terms of per capita GDP and in terms of productivity. But China, which at a point in time, and I think which at a point in time was the largest, largest populated country in the world, was able to sit back and have a strategic thinking session with themselves, for themselves, and by themselves. And that is very important. A strategic thinking session with themselves, for themselves, by themselves. They didn't rely on external bodies like the Bretton Woods institutions to give them, economic blueprints on how to build their economies. And so they developed the one China, one focus policy. And they were able to close up their economy, close up their countries, and practice some degree of partial mercantilism, partial protectionism, and sent most of their best brains abroad to go and learn, especially in the United States and other Western countries, and they came back. Unfortunately, we're having a renaissance where the teachers are now becoming the students of the students that were once taught. And that is where the problem actually is. So, what has China done? What has China got rightly? China had a strategic focus. China had a blueprint of where it needed to be and put all hands on the deck. And we must emphasize the fact that China had stability. I wouldn't want to go into terms of what kind of the political system of governance is ideal, whether the Chinese communist or partial capitalist communist kind of system is ideal. That is not the basis for the discussion. The actual thing we must focus on is what they have done rightly and what countries from the global south, Nigeria in particular, can learn from China. Now, some may want to argue that China is not as diversified in terms of ethnicity like Nigeria. That is wrong. In China, you have over 40 to 50 different dialects. But again, it was the one China, one people policy where a major dialect, Mandarin, was made to be the single lingua franca of the country. And people learned along that line and people were able to build the focus and follow the vision of Chairman Mao. And today, China pairs and pairs along with other Western countries as one of the largest economies in the world.
Thank you, Ken, for that very early submission. If you listen to Tim Cook, one of the things he said in that short clip was the fact that if you go to America today, you can find a tools engineer only in a small room. But in China, you can find them in multiple football fields. So which means that their education system has been able to create people with high IQ that produce innovative tools that the world needs. And Tim Cook said that's why companies are moving to China, not just necessarily because of low labor costs. What has happened to our institutions of learning? Why are we not producing engineers that can pioneer innovations? Are you there?
Sir, so I couldn't pick up on everything that you actually said. I actually lost the audio there.
What I'm saying is that Tim Cook says the reason why companies are moving to China is because they have a lot of tools engineer, real innovative tools engineer. And of course, high-tech industry needs those kind of engineers. Say in America, you can only find them if you put all of them together, they can only stay in one room. But in China, you find them in multiple fields. I'm asking, because you have done a comparison between Nigeria in the 60s and China, what has happened to us? How has the intellectuals in Nigeria not been able to produce tools engineer that can attract foreign investment to this environment?
For the first time, I will want to compare apples with oranges because it seems that between Nigeria and China, we have some dynamics and some strategic characteristics that could be likened to one another. Now, if we do a trajectory of the progress of Nigeria from 1960 and look at that of China, what actually did happen? Now, there's a school of thought that actually says that the military incursion into politics in 1966 was the biggest bane of Nigeria. And that between 1963 and 1966, when Nigeria became a republic, we're doing extremely well. We had people from Singapore come to learn what we were doing and doing rightly. We had our GDP. We at a point in time, I'm not too sure of that. I'd like to fact check that later. We're able to borrow money to. We were able to fund some projects, even in the colonial, in the country of the colonial masters. And I think technically we still keep doing that. So we must trace it because politics and economics are Siamese twins that go hand in hand. I think we started getting it wrong when the military decided to enforce themselves into Nigerian politics, destabilize the economy, rather than face the purpose for which they were employed, which was to protect the territorial integrity of the nation. They thought it best. It was a contagion effect from what had happened in Ghana and a few neighboring African, West African countries, and that began to hold sway. And I think that was also borrowed from what had happened in Spain and what had happened in some Latin American countries. So the the revolution of the 1966 incursion into politics, I think, took us down this path. And ever since, I can't particularly say that we have been able to recover. Now, we must also look at the kind of political culture that we have in our country. What is the basic characteristic of our political culture? And until we are able to change that political culture, there will be a challenge for us to actually attain the height of economic growth and development that we need to attain to. I overheard you just before I joined at the studio on how subnationals in Nigeria, for instance, are indebted, heavily indebted, to some foreign agencies, to some, foreign financial institutions. And then you look at the constitutional infractions that actually give room to that. Why would a particular government come in place, for instance, now, borrow money from the World Bank and leave that state after about 8 years or 4 years, not pay that money back, and nobody is held accountable? And then Nigeria has to bear that burden and not the subnational. So I think the way that the country is structured in itself is an infraction for us to actually develop geometrically, to actually have moved beyond where we were in 1966, instead of priding ourselves with a few bridges, with a few expansion and escalation in the number of universities we have, a number of professors we have, there has been no real development. In China, for instance, in the last 10 years, in the last 20 years, in the last 2 decades, China has been able to lift about 80 to 70% of its population out of poverty, whereas the reverse has been the case in Nigeria. So we can't be talking about progress. We can't be talking about development without talking about politics, without talking about the actual nature of our constitutionalism, without talking about our system and our structure of governance. Once we can identify these critical catalysts and see what we can do to reinvent them and see how we can actually build a one Nigeria, one people voice, then I think that the sky would even be the limit for us in Nigeria. Currently, we have the third wave of brain drain in Nigeria. Um, who is responsible for that? When we look at the economics of the country, I would not say if the government or if things are bad or things are not bad. I don't want to go into the argument. I think that we are having reforms, and I think that we're having a reset, we're having shifts. But I also think that those reforms came too early, and they didn't quite care for the Pareto optimality and Pareto effect and Pareto multiplier effects of how these reforms were actually ushered in. So it's a question of politics, it's a question of policy, it's a question also of the kind of people that we have entrusted with power and with the development of initiatives to take Nigeria from being a factor-driven economy to being an efficiency-driven economy, and finally, like China, to become an innovation and technological.
Ken, I want you to speak to the role. I want you to speak to the role of the intellectuals in revolutions and transforming society, and how has the Nigerian intellectual fared in this regard?
Well, I think you would want me to indict my constituency, Dr. Idahosa. That is where you are pushing me to. And I would not be indicting my senior colleagues or the ones that are coming behind me. I would say that to a great extent, the intelligentsia in Nigeria has been made to play to the gallery. Why? Because education and the outcomes of the intelligentsia and the outcomes of devotion to a lifetime of academics and the academia has been politicized and has been made impoverished. When I was in the university as at 1996, it will surprise you to know that the take-home pay for a professor as at 1996 was 12,000 naira a month. Presently, I don't want to be quoted, but I don't fear to be quoted. I think the take-home pay for a professor in Nigeria today in a federal public university, away from allowances, is about 400 to 450,000 a month. Sir, how much is that in dollar terms? A little under $200 a month. So how do you expect somebody that earns $200 a month in today's global economy to start focusing on revolution, start focusing on economic, political, and social thoughts that will lift his country or lift her country from the economic abyss, malaise that we found ourselves? Instead, it will be how best they can cater for themselves and cater for their families. So the conditions of service, the conditions of the economy definitely has a negative correlation with the extent to which the intelligentsia can actually contribute to taking us out of where we are. And that is why you see even in public institutions and even in private, tertiary institutions these days, that people tend to have side gigs so that they can complement their jobs. And the quality of research it seems to be a little bit low because even the government is not funding the research as much as it ought to, as it ought to. But I hope with some of the policies that are coming on board, there will be a revamp of the situation and they will find more contributions and more commitment on the part of the academia and the intelligentsia to take us to the next level of.
So the poverty of the intellectuals has led to our intellectual poverty.
Well, I think I disagree with you that we have a situation of intellectual poverty in Nigeria because when you look at some of the conferences, you look at some of the outputs of research, some Nigerian intellectuals have been able to still stand out. I would not say it is intellectual poverty as it were. I would just call it intellectual discrimination. I think the intellectuals to a great extent are discriminated against in the Nigerian society. To that extent, I would say they are not valued. And they are valued to the extent to which they can be docile in the face of politicians where they do not have the power to speak truth to power, where they do not have the economic viability to be able to speak truth to power and to stand by their words. So it is a negative correlation, and I'm certain that my generation and your generation, Dr. Idahosa, should be able to correct that anomaly.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ken. I'm glad you referenced the case of university professors who are earning 400,000 naira. I will advocate for the least they should be paid ₦1 million, and the doctor should follow with 800,000 naira. Then maybe any other lecturer can go with $500,000 or between 650,000 naira. Now, away from that, let me take you back to China. Currently, as we speak, the current administration of President Donald Trump in the United States of America is shaking the whole world. Is China perturbed? Well, we can't really tell for now, but it looks like since Donald Trump has started putting out some policies that is going to tariff some of the goods and importations will be coming to China, it seems like China is reciprocating by tariffing the agricultural produce coming from the United States of America, which is the biggest or one of the biggest sectors in the United States of America. And as a result of that, China is now turning their face to importing poultry from Brazil. And they are also looking at India. So it looks like China will not want to, they want to meet the United States of America face to face, head to head, shoulder to shoulder, and not to fall back or be perturbed by virtue of the trade policies coming. Do you think Nigeria stands any advantage to mitigate any of these policies by way of trade coming from the United States for us to stand the ground to make sure that we are not undermined in global trade?
All right. It's at this juncture that I like to speak the truth to power and speak the truth about the situation and the status quo of our country. Because it's always the popular thing to play with a lot of data. And in so doing, we play and discuss and credit issues to the gallery. Now, the first credit we must give to China is the fact that China is, amongst other things, able to actually diversify when it has challenges of this nature. So one of the things that China has started doing is, and started preparing for this time as though, they had the prophetic revelation of biblical proportions with respect to what could happen over the next, and that's what we call strategic planning and strategic thinking, all right? And strategic insights, all right? And strategic foresight. So there has been this foresight, and that's why since 2010, China has been planning on how to diversify the economy and how to diversify the pattern of growth of the Chinese economy. Now, between 1978 and 2009, the pattern of growth for the Chinese economy was to pursue manufacturing dominance and to pursue an export-led hypothesis, an export-led, export-driven hypothesis, which made China one of the greatest exporters of finished goods in the world and a big destination for the attraction of foreign direct investment, where you have companies, American companies like the Apples, like the HPs of this world, the Nikes of this world, actually relocating their facilities to China because of low labor costs. And like Tim Cook said, because of the high degree of skill and manpower that China had been able to invest over the years, and which made expertise cheaper for some of these international multinational companies to actually procure labor and get their goods produced and have seamless supply chains to have these goods distributed across the world. So, with what is happening with Trumpism 2.0 now, Trumpism is all about putting America first and ensuring that they are reshoring production, the reshoring manufacturing, facilities and manufacturing activities to bring them back into America so that these jobs that have been hitherto exported can now be domiciled in the American space. And in economics, we have economic reciprocity, where, for instance, when you place a particular level of tariffs, for instance, American government has placed tariffs on 500 billion, 550 billion naira worth of goods exported from China or imported from China into America with a tariff of about 25%. And China has, reciprocated. Now, the implications of that is that there will be price wars, there will be price distortions, and there will be price escalations across the different regional economic blocks in the world. So what has China done? China is now transiting. Okay, we don't have to export everything. We should now begin to think of how we can stimulate internal demand and, harness a strategy called the dual circulation strategy, where they are able to balance what they are doing externally with what is being done internally. Where does Nigeria come in? Now, with respect to the kind of tariffs, with respect to the kind of trade wars, with respect to the kind of policies that American, as an economic power, is actually pursuing across the world now, we need to first ask the question, what is the trade volume between America as a single country, not a continent, and Africa as a continent? What is the amount of the GDP or the trade flow, all right, that China, American African relations have in terms of trade? The last time I checked, it was up to 10%. So Nigeria shouldn't be bothered about the relations or the tariffs coming in or some of what the negative multiplier effect or the negative externalities that will come from new policies that will be championed by the Trump administration. Instead, Nigeria should do what China has done and what China will continue to do. How do we diversify our economy to stimulate local demand? How do we diversify the character of the Nigerian people to think Nigerian and buy Nigerian? The way forward for the Nigerian economy is to go back to what we had in 1970s, where we had refrigerators produced in Nigeria, where we had batteries produced in Badagry, where we had, motor plants like the Volkswagen, the Peugeots, producing cars in Kaduna, producing cars in Badagry, and we had a lot of production facilities going on in this country until the structural adjustment program was introduced and until from external forces were made to devalue our currency under the guise that will better boost our economic productivity and boost other economic activities. So for Nigeria, it is time to think internally. For Nigeria, it is time to begin to look for strategic insights as a people, as a government, on what we can do, what we should do, not and balance the positive economics and the normative economics. With positive economics, we talk about what should be. With normative economics, we talk about what has been. So what should be? We should start stimulating manufacturing. We should start stimulating indigenous manufacturing. We should start stimulating indigenous demand, and we should start placing tariffs on imported goods also, so that we can have Nigerians produce goods, invite companies into Nigeria to produce goods in Nigeria, produce goods for Nigeria, and satisfy the Nigerian local market and export what is left. As we stand, as we speak, Nigeria remains a monoproduct economy. Yes, we keep saying.
Dr. Kenneth Ikenwa, let's look at the China situation. You've been talking about Nigeria looking inward and producing. So in the case of China, they are not having that challenge, but the challenge they are having even is overcapacity in industrialization. There is deflation in China, and that's a source of worry for the Chinese government at the moment, what that could lead to. Let's look at that. First of all, China developed its production capacity. Now that production capacity is even more than the country can consume. That's why China is also exporting. How do you think they can handle that challenge? And on the other side for Nigeria, as we encourage Nigeria to look internally and begin to produce, is there anything to learn, observe, and plan for so that we don't also get to a point where Nigeria begins to experience deflation? Understanding that whatever side that we are on, there could be advantage and disadvantage depending on the time and season. How do we handle that? But let's talk about China first, handling its deflation issue.
Well, if I was in a position to advise China, I would go the route of some unorthodox economics or economics orthodoxy, unorthodoxy. And what does that mean? One of the things that I've not highlighted is the fact that China is experiencing the kind of problem it's experiencing, even with its population of over 1 billion, because the population of China is actually aging. And don't forget, between the 1960s and 1970s, in order to curb the Chinese population, there was a one family, one child policy. And to a great extent now, that policy is coming back to have a negative vibration, a negative multiplier effect on the Chinese economy. Because whilst they tried to curb their population and still left it at 1 billion, they increased their capacity utilization for production, but were not able to increase the capacity for local demand, domestic consumption. So on orthodoxy, the first thing that China needs to do is to start encouraging people to have more children. Because the population is actually aging. The population of those that are skillful, the population of those that are very productive is actually aging and are not willing to give birth to more children. And whether we like it or not, the great professor of economics, Malthus, talked about population and impact of population on economics. And you cannot be talking about the growth in GDP or a deflation in GDP or a reduction in GDP if you don't calculate it vis-a-vis what the population of the country is. Now, bring that same argument back to Nigeria and see whether that economic unorthodoxy would work. It wouldn't work because right now we have a population that is growing faster than the kind of income or than the rate of income that Nigeria can earn in terms of per capita income or in terms of the GDP collectively. So what can Nigeria actually do to avoid this glut, this situation, this impasse that China is actually experiencing? There is a serious correlation, a serious relationship between the level of a country's literacy, the literacy rate of a country. And now we're not just talking of the literacy of the ability that has to do with the ability to read and write. We're now moving from, reading literacy to actually digital literacy. So as we speak, the literacy level in Nigeria hovers between 55% to 50% or thereabouts. And then you look at the literacy level and put it side by side, the poverty rate, the actual poverty rate, and you will see that the distance is not much. So one of the first things that China actually did was to liberalize education in China and to ensure that education was raised to the best standard. After sending their citizens out, they invited foreign professors to come and teach their people, and China is also a destination for foreign education and attract a lot of foreign currency in that sector. So the first thing Nigeria has to do, if we're going to make the right decision, is to stop the mal-education of the Nigerian population. Today we have graduates that are not employable. How do we explain that? Today we have a population, like you rightly said before I came into the studio, I came onto the virtual studio, that collects money to be able to vote for somebody. It means that we are not thinking in the right direction that will create progress. So I'm not going to speak too much about economic jargons or what Nigeria needs to do. I will pull it down to what we actually need to do. Once we are able to rightly educate our people, people would understand why it is better to patronize a made in Nigerian cobbler than to patronize a French or an American cobbler with their made in America or made in French shoes. Once we are able to escalate the resources that is given to Nigerian universities, whether private or public, and allow people to be properly educated and thoroughly educated and given the best like they had in the 70s, we will not have the best of Nigerians traveling out of this country to go and give the same resources for which they were trained in Nigeria to other countries just because they want to get the citizenship of those countries. So for me, the major catalyst, all right, to preserving the economic dream, the economic progress, the economic potential of Nigeria is to start looking at the educational sector. Once we can educate our people properly, they can take the right decisions, and those decisions will be in the interest of economic progress and not economic sabotage.
Okay, thank you very much. Now, Dr. Ken, I want to reverse you to something that Dr. Osamhanze said in the studio. I know recently there's been, because when Tim Cook was speaking, he was talking about how the technologies, the tools for engineering and all of that, and how China has proliferated lots of manpower concerning that technology and how that has, boosted manufacturing in China to the extent that they have enough for local consumption and they are exporting to the whole of Africa and even Europe, including the United States as we speak. We need to replicate that. And recently, the colleges of education, the tango between the BSc, those who acquire BSc now, the BTech for the, what are they called again? These are these are lower institutions.
Because it may just be lower. Just say polytechnics.
Polytechnics,
it's a
great.
Of learning. You see, that thing you said now is why they're having issues.
So now, how can we draw the line? Because with this recent policy and the recent direction we are heading, it's like everybody is coming after your job as a lecturer, as a white collar, a blue collar job, and nobody wants to get their hands dirty in the manufacturing hubs again in Nigeria. How can we retain that irrespective of the new policy?
Well, the Nigerian economy has become a paper-based economy rather than a merit-based economy. And so we focus so much on degrees, individuals and their degrees, without actually looking at individuals and their pedigree. So we have a lot of individuals that are educated, even to the doctorate level, with these humongous degrees, but do not have pedigree. Now, any serious country that is serious about industrialization and serious about economic growth, exponential and quantum economic growth, must focus on technical education. Now, let me bust your bubble, or maybe I should increase the bubble. And I'm not going to mention certain companies in Nigeria, but you see some of the multinational companies that actually come to Nigeria to get a lot of construction works done. And you know some of the big ones, at least you know some of the big fours. Let's not unduly advertise them here. I invite them to come and advertise on Soup. It's a good platform to actually, market and sell their business. But I know, because I've interacted with some of these people, that some of these expatriates that direct the supervision of these jobs, of this construction of bridges, of this construction of towers, are actually products of technical vocational education and colleges in those countries from where they come, being made supervisors, being made foremen, being made heads of department, ahead and above our own graduates and master's degree holders of civil engineering, of mechanical engineering, of electrical engineering. Now, the problem that you have highlighted, the HND, BSc dichotomy, and BSc conflict, is even further reinforced by the fact that now most institutions which were hitherto created as schools of technology, as polytechnics, where people actually get their hands down and grind with debt and get the actual practical output and practical input into mechanics and dynamics of machines, are now striving to convert those institutions into what? Into universities. Because we have built a system that has glorified the BSc degree and glorified BSc degree ahead and above the HND or the OND degrees. And we find this even in the civil service. And I'm not going to mention any civil service, but I know that some law enforcement agencies have a different cadre and scope and arrangement for promoting those that are polytechnic graduates as against those that are university graduates. Well, I want to go straight to the solution, and I hope those I hope the Minister of Education actually will be listening at this point in time. I think the solution is very simple. We can not continue to proliferate degrees and hope that we can attain higher degrees of economic growth and development. I think what should actually be done with respect to this BSc HND dichotomy is to see to it that those that are HND graduates are maybe allowed to come back to their universities or go to the universities or from the same institutions from which they graduated, have another additional 1 year of internship or 1 year of intense scholarship, and they can now be awarded what we now call BTech. I think that is a level playing ground, and I think that is what will put an end to this discrimination.
But don't you think that will further reinforce what the dichotomy is about? Now, you made reference to foreign countries and their expatriates in Nigeria. These expatriates, some of them were trained by vocational and technical institutions. They come over here, they are heads over those who have higher academic qualification. And I want to believe that the reason these companies place them over those with higher academic qualification is because in the field they play in, it is the technical expertise that is relevant. So it is not your paper that is speaking, it is what you can do. What technical expertise do you have? Now, coming back to Nigeria, does it necessarily mean that because someone has technical skill, technical knowledge, that person has to be awarded a paper that places him below someone with a higher or a perceived higher paper certification? Is that not a discouragement for those who want to get their hands dirty, in quotes? Looking at how much we need people to get their hands dirty and how the dirtiness has produced wealth and advantage for other countries.
Well, we can go on and on with deep reflections on this subject matter, but I think as a country, we have gotten to a point of strategic inflection, where even the Minister of Education and members of the Green and the Red Chambers are beginning to think in the better direction for us, to deal with this quagmire and put a complete paid rest to it. But let's come back to the crux of what you have actually discussed. And it comes down to the quality of what is actually being gotten from the two ends and the two extremes of training. So whether you attended a university, like I did, or whether you attended a polytechnic, like some other persons did, right? The important thing is that you've gotten some form of training. You want to call it technical, you want to call it vocational. And for the most part, I think that those with degrees in Nigeria are also being discriminated, because for the most part, they say, oh, those that went to universities only have theoretical knowledge. So those of us who went to universities, I'm sympathizing with our cohort, because sometimes we're also discriminated against by saying, oh, those they just have theoretical knowledge, they don't have the technical knowledge. I think the most important thing with knowledge is the ability to apply it to solve basic problems of society. And that's why I've insisted that having degrees without pedigrees doesn't actually take Nigeria anywhere. And whether you have a diploma or have a degree, the important thing is, what do you have to offer? And that is why the world is moving away from paper certifications now and from the normal, usual forms of education now. That's why we're shifting from the brick and mortar education to online education, and people are getting certified even from online courses and able to be productive. So the real question here is the productivity question. What can that individual, irrespective of whatever institution that you have attended, what are you bringing to the table in terms of solving solutions, in terms of value creation, in terms of value delivery, and in terms of value capturing? It is a systemic problem, and I can't particularly trace where we, started this problem, where we created this problem, because I'll give you a history of myself. When I was about to write my first joint admissions matriculation examinations, I think in 1993, about 32 years ago, the truth of the matter is that I was more inclined into going to a polytechnic than going to a university. Why was that? Because I wanted to be an accountant, because I had a cousin that read accountancy. All those things we did. We had big brothers that read this. We had uncles that worked in CBN. Or what did they study? And the thinking then was that the best place to study for accounting or accountancy was a polytechnic. How did we shift from that kind of focus? Those that would want to study anything that has to do with machines will be told that the best way to study would be in a polytechnic or a college of technology. How did we shift to that focus? How did we shift from that focus, from that emphasis? So it is a systemic problem that we are facing. And
systemic problem indeed. Let me take you back to China. Systemic problem indeed. Let me get you back to China. Two things you have said, and I want just quickly to respond. The first is Chinese government has embraced secular economy. And of course, which of course across Europe and every other part of the world, a lot of people are embracing. The question is, why is it difficult for Africans really to work in that direction for a secular economy? Because when people think about secular economy in Africa today, we only look at recycling. Nobody look at sharing economy. Nobody look at product as a service. Nobody look at industrial symbiosis, where, of course, what is a waste in one industry becomes a raw material for another company. And therefore, companies are not cited contiguously to be able to make this flow. Because here, what we're talking about is competitiveness. There's a cultural factor here that is making it difficult for us to actually embrace wholly a secular economy. I can remember some years ago, I did a study for a particular telecom company, and I was asking them for asset sharing. And it was so strange to them. I said, why should we have to share our mass with another person? That's one. Number two, we're also seeing that in response to the tariffs the Trump tariffs against Chinese products, that China are trying to see how to incentivize their locals to be able to buy, and that, of course, will lead to increase in wage to address the issue of deflation. What do you think will be this implication for the Chinese economy in the coming year?
All right. You took the words out of my mouth. So I would say, to an extent, you're a pseudo-psychologist with respect to the first issue that has to do with secular economy and secular economics, and why most African countries cannot actually embrace that and allow the economies to be benefited by going secular or by adopting secularity. And what did you say? What I just said in my mind. Our culture as a people, our culture as Africans, you need not agree with me, but the culture and the culture that permeates into the critical institutional aspects of our society, from politics, from family life, to religion, and every other aspect of, of social institutions. Every kind of social institution that we find out is affected by our culture. And that culture has around it a foundation that is built on waste, which the Japanese call moda. From the way we even handle our budgets, from the way we actually distribute resources, from the way we actually explore resources. Look at what is happening in the Niger Delta, for instance. So let's talk about secularity. Let's go to the Niger Delta. Look at what's happening there. Nigeria is not the only country with oil. Angola has oil. Do we find all these villages in Angola? Do we find all these villages in Saudi Arabia? Do we find them in Gulf countries? Does Shell, do some companies devastate, some exploration companies devastate the ecologies and the environment of other countries where they go to? But it happens in Nigeria, and we take, we bet an eye and we just forget about it. And the chiefs and people just collect the money, collect their royalties, and move on. So we must have and address the issue of cultural reengineering and bring it to sit as a catalyst and foundation of our economics if we're going to be able to benefit from the dynamics of secularity and secular economics. Okay, let's come back to China and what China has done. And I've said China is diversifying its trade interests across different regions in the world. But much more than that, China realizes that there is actually no economic depression or economic recession as we speak globally. And so if there's a recession in certain countries, it's a pocket of individual countries that are actually experiencing recession. Now, what does recession do? Recession reduces the purchasing power parity of citizens and the purchasing power parities of a particular government. Nigeria has experienced some recession, but what we're experiencing now is not recession in economic terms. It's a result of the economic restructuring and economic reforms that we're actually undergoing, which may limit the extent to which government may spend and may want the individuals or the individuals to actually spend in terms of purchasing power parity. I sincerely doubt if the Chinese new economic strategy that focuses on dual circulation strategy, balancing what they've been able to achieve externally with what and bringing that home to drive economic growth, stimulate economic demand, stimulate aggregate demand, and see to it that their citizens are buying what they also produce. I doubt if it may work. So what China is doing alongside that to counterbalance the possibilities or the probabilities that may not actually give them the 100% effect or the Pareto optimality effect that they hope to attain is to see to it that they are diversifying their interest and trade interest, import and export interest with other countries. Like you rightly said, now they're now exporting beef, importing beef from countries like Brazil, and they'll be looking down to major countries in the global economic south to do more business with, to shift more aid and shift more investment in, so that they can have a valve with which they can actually escalate their resources outside the economy and maintain that economic growth and that economic balance. So what is on ground now is what in economics we call the good stroke bad paradox. It is a good thing, happening for China. It could also be bad, but it will be bad to the extent, it will be bad and paradoxical to the extent to which China is able to actually mobilize other countries to buy into the China strategy, to buy into new China relations, and to see to it and promote that public relations out there that China is not interested in becoming a neo-colonial power. Because the real question here is China a risk or is China a catalyst? Is China a risk to the growth of economies across the world, whether in the global north or global south, or is China, or can China be seen and said to be a catalyst for growth, especially for countries in the global economic south? And I will spotlight Nigeria in that direction and within the frame of that question. If me, to an extent, if we harness that relationship properly in Africa, we could see China, we could harness and appropriate China as a catalyst and see it less as a risk to our economic growth and to our economic independence going forward. So the issues of neocolonialism actually begs a lot of questions behind the intentions of China escalating its investments into different countries and in different sectors across different economies in and within the global economic south.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kenneth Ikenwa, who is a business and social policy expert. He's also a lecturer at University of Lagos. Thank you for the brilliant submissions made on the show today. Always my pleasure. I hope to be with you in the studio soon. We hope to have you in the studio very soon so that we can have more fiery, brilliant conversation on other issues.